The sun was sinking behind the hills, leaving a warm orange glow over the small town of Dry Creek. The streets were quiet except for the creak of old wooden signs and the soft brushing of tumbleweeds rolling across the dirt road. This was the kind of place where everyone knew each other. People here were simple, working hard all day, keeping their heads down and trying to stay out of trouble. But that evening, a different kind of silence filled the town. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy and cold. A strange uneasiness spread like a shadow. The townsfolk were whispering behind closed doors, peeking through cracked windows, afraid to come out. Something had happened earlier that day, something no one wanted to talk about out loud. At the edge of town, just beyond the last row of houses, stood a small wooden cabin. The roof was broken and the paint on the walls had peeled away. A cold wind blew through the gaps in the boards. Inside that cabin lay an elderly woman named Margaret Hayes. She was paralyzed from the waist down and could not walk. She had once traveled with her family in a wagon train that stopped in Dry Creek, but when fear and sickness struck, her family packed up and left without her. They were scared. Scared of getting sick, scared of being stuck in a dying town. So they made a choice, and a cruel and selfish choice, and left Margaret behind. All that afternoon, people passed by the cabin. They saw her lying there, weak and helpless, her white hair tangled from the wind. She called for help in a soft, trembling voice, but no one answered. Some people crossed to the other side of the street. Some pretended not to hear. Others closed their doors and whispered, "It's not our problem." The town was living in fear of sickness. Stories spread faster than the wind in Dry Creek. Some said the woman was cursed. Others said she carried something dangerous. But the truth was simple. She was just an old woman who needed help. As the last light of the day faded, the chill grew stronger. The old boards of the cabin creaked like an injured animal. Margaret stared at the wooden ceiling with tired eyes. She could hear the distant sound of horses, laughter from the saloon, and doors being shut one after another. It was the sound of life carrying on without her. In another part of town, Thomas Weller was sweeping sawdust off the floor of his workshop. Thomas was a tall, quiet man in his 40s. He was not rich, but he was respected for his hard work. He built furniture, repaired fences, and sometimes crafted coffins when someone passed away. He lived alone in a small house he had built with his own hands. Thomas had heard the whispers about the old woman all day. He tried to focus on his work, but the thought wouldn't leave his mind. He could still hear her weak voice calling from the edge of town. Most people tried to forget it, but Thomas couldn't. He leaned on his broom and sighed. He didn't like trouble. He didn't like standing out. He just liked living quietly. But deep inside, he had a heart that couldn't look away from someone in need. His mind drifted back to years ago when he was just a young man traveling west. He had been lost in the wilderness once, cold, hungry, and alone. A stranger had given him shelter and saved his life. He had never forgotten that kindness. As the sky grew darker, Thomas put away his tools. He lit a lantern and stepped outside. The night air was sharp and dry. The streets were empty now. Everyone was hiding inside their homes. He walked slowly toward the cabin at the edge of town. His boots made soft thuds on the dusty road. People peeked from their windows as he passed. Some whispered, "Where's he going?" Others shook their heads. But Thomas didn't stop. His steps were steady, and the lantern in his hand cast a warm circle of light around him. When he reached the cabin, the door was half open. The sound of the wind howling through the cracks made the place feel even lonelier. Thomas knocked softly on the door. "Miss Hayes?" he called in a calm voice. There was a pause, then a faint reply. "Who's there?" "It's Thomas Weller," he said. "The carpenter." Inside, Margaret tried to lift her head. She was thin and pale, wrapped in a torn blanket. Her eyes were tired, but when she saw the light from the lantern, a small spark of hope appeared in them. "Are you here?" "To help," she whispered. Thomas stepped inside slowly. The air smelled of damp wood and dust. He knelt down beside her and looked at her kindly. "Yes, ma'am. I'm here to help." Her hands trembled as she tried to hold his. "No one came," she said softly. "They were all so afraid." Thomas felt a lump in his throat. He had seen fear many times before, but never something this cold. "They're scared," he said gently, "but I'm not leaving you here." He placed the lantern on a broken table and looked around the room. The roof was cracked, the floor was covered in dirt, and there was hardly any food. Margaret had been left there with nothing. She could have been gone by morning if no one came. Thomas walked to the door and looked back toward the town. All the windows were dark, but he knew people were watching. No one else was going to help her. If anything was going to change, it had to start with him. He went back to his workshop and gathered some old wooden planks, rope, and a thick wool blanket. Then he returned to the cabin. Margaret watched him quietly, her eyes filled with both fear and hope. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm going to make something to carry you," Thomas said. He set the lantern down again and began working on the floor of the cabin. The sound of the hammer echoed softly in the night. He worked quickly but carefully, tying the ropes, nailing the boards together and making a stretcher strong enough to hold her weight. The lantern light danced on his face as he worked, and his hands moved like someone who had built many things in his life. Margaret watched in silence. For the first time in days, she didn't feel completely alone. She didn't have strength to move, but inside a small warmth returned to her heart. When the stretcher was ready, Thomas placed the wool blanket over it. Then he knelt beside her. "We'll get you to the clinic," he said in a calm, steady voice. "You'll be warm and safe there." She looked at him with watery eyes. Why are you helping me?" she asked softly. He paused for a moment. "Because someone once helped me when no one else would," he replied. Carefully, Thomas lifted her onto the stretcher. She winced at the cold night air, but his hands were gentle and steady. He wrapped the blanket around her and tightened the ropes just enough to keep her secure. Then he took the two ends of the stretcher, lifted it onto his shoulders, and stepped out into the night. The streets of Dry Creek were still quiet. Lamps flickered in windows as people peeked out. They saw Thomas walking down the road with the old woman on the stretcher. Some whispered again. Some turned away. No one offered to help, but Thomas didn't need their help. He just kept walking. His boots pressed into the dirt with a soft rhythm. Margaret felt the rocking of the stretcher and the cool wind on her face. She closed her eyes, not out of fear but out of trust. For the first time since she had been abandoned, she knew someone cared. As they passed the saloon, two men standing at the doorway stared. One of them muttered, "He's a fool." But Thomas didn't stop. He reached the small clinic on the hill just outside town. The doctor there, an older man with kind eyes, came running out when he saw Thomas. "Good heavens," the doctor said. "I didn't think anyone would bring her." Thomas set the stretcher down gently. "She's weak," he said. "But she's still breathing. Can you help her?" The doctor nodded quickly and opened the clinic door. "Of course. Bring her in." Margaret opened her eyes and saw the light of the clinic. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Thank you, Thomas." He smiled gently. "You don't have to thank me, ma'am. Just get better." As the doctor and his assistant lifted her inside, Thomas stepped back into the cool night air. The lantern light from the clinic shone behind him, and the stars above the quiet town seemed a little brighter. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if the town would change or not. But in that moment he had done what was right. He had chosen kindness over fear, and even though no one said it out loud, the people who had watched from behind their windows knew they had just witnessed something rare. One man had done what the whole town refused to, and that was enough to begin a story that would be told in Dry Creek for years to come. The night air in Dry Creek was cool and quiet after Thomas left Margaret in the doctor's care. A few stars twinkled above the dark hills, and the lanterns in the clinic windows gave off a warm, soft light. Thomas stood outside for a long moment, hands resting on the handles of the wooden stretcher he had built. His heart was beating calmly, but his mind was full. He had done what no one else had the courage to do. Behind him, the town was still. The windows that had once been full of silent eyes were now dark. People had watched him carry the old woman, but no one had stepped forward. Thomas didn't blame them completely. He knew fear could make people turn away, but he also knew kindness could change fear. Inside the clinic, the doctor worked quickly. Margaret lay on a clean bed with a wool blanket over her, her face pale but a little more peaceful now. The doctor, whose name was Dr. Green, checked her breathing, offered her warm broth, and placed a pillow behind her head. "You were lucky," he told her softly. "If that man hadn't brought you here tonight, things could have been very different." Margaret opened her eyes slowly. Her voice was weak, but there was a calm strength in it. "I didn't think anyone would come," she whispered. Dr. Green smiled kindly. "Someone did, and that says a lot." Thomas pushed the door open quietly and stepped inside. The doctor nodded at him in approval. "You did a good thing, Thomas," he said. "She'll need time to heal and rest, but she's safe now." Thomas walked to Margaret's bedside. She looked at him with tired but grateful eyes. "You didn't have to help me," she said softly. Thomas smiled gently. "I know, but I wanted to." She reached out a shaky hand and he held it carefully. Her hand felt fragile, but her grip was warm. For the first time in days, she felt safe. And for the first time in years, Thomas felt like what he had done truly mattered. The next morning, news spread quickly through Dry Creek. By the time the sun rose and the roosters started crowing, everyone in town was talking about it. In the bakery, two women whispered over loaves of bread. In the general store, men leaned against barrels and shook their heads. Some said Thomas was brave. Others said he had taken a big risk, but no matter what they said, no one could ignore the truth. Thomas had done what no one else dared. Later that day, Thomas returned to the clinic. The wooden porch creaked under his boots as he walked in. Inside, Margaret was sitting up with pillows behind her back. Her hair was brushed, and the doctor's assistant had given her a clean dress. She looked older, yes, but also stronger than she had the night before. "You came back," she said with a soft smile. "Of course," Thomas replied. "I wanted to make sure you're all right." She nodded slowly. "Better than before." "Thank you, Thomas. I'll never forget this." Thomas pulled up a chair and sat beside her. "You don't have to thank me. I just did what anyone should have done." But they both knew the truth. Not everyone had done it, only him. In the following days, Thomas visited the clinic every morning after work. He brought her soup, warm bread, and sometimes flowers from the wild fields beyond the hills. Margaret told him stories of her younger days. How she had traveled across the West in a wagon, how she loved to sing when the campfire burned at night, and how she dreamed of seeing a peaceful home before her days ended. Thomas listened quietly. He didn't talk much about himself, but Margaret could see in his eyes that he understood loneliness. Meanwhile, the townsfolk kept watching. At first they whispered. Some avoided the clinic altogether. But slowly something began to change. A little girl from the bakery came by one afternoon with a small basket of apples for Margaret. Then a man from the general store dropped off a blanket. The town school teacher came in one evening to read her a story. It started small, but it grew. The woman they had once feared had become someone they wanted to care for. And the reason for that change stood in his workshop every evening. Thomas Weller, the carpenter with a quiet heart. One afternoon, Dr. Green stepped out of the clinic and found Thomas repairing the fence outside. "Thomas," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth, "you've done more for this town than you think. They're different now. They're learning to care again." Thomas looked up with a small smile. "I just helped one person, Doc." The doctor shook his head. "No, you lit a light in a place that had grown cold." Margaret's health improved over the next few weeks. Though she couldn't walk, she grew stronger. She sat by the window every day, wrapped in a shawl, watching the people who now came to visit her. The same town that had once turned its back now greeted her with warm smiles and kind words. Thomas kept visiting her. Sometimes they sat in silence. Sometimes she talked about her past, and he talked a little about his life too. He told her about his quiet home, about how he liked to fix broken things, not just wood, but anything that needed mending. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in gold and pink, Margaret turned to him with a thoughtful look. "Thomas," she said, "you gave me more than help. You gave me a chance to live again. You reminded this town what kindness looks like." Thomas lowered his gaze, a little shy. "I just didn't want to walk away." Margaret smiled softly. "That's what makes it special. Most people do." Weeks passed and spring arrived in Dry Creek. The wind was no longer cold. It was soft and warm. Flowers bloomed near the river and children played outside. The town felt alive in a way it hadn't in a long time. One morning, Thomas built a sturdy wooden chair with wheels, something he had never made before. He worked for days, sanding the wood smooth, tightening every bolt, making sure it rolled easily. When it was done, he brought it to the clinic. "This is for you," he told Margaret. She stared at the chair with wide eyes. "For me?" He nodded. "You deserve to see the world outside the clinic. The sun, the breeze, the town." Tears filled her eyes as she touched the smooth wooden arms of the chair. "Thomas, I don't know how to thank you for all this." "You already did," he said with a warm smile. From that day on, Thomas would push Margaret through the streets of Dry Creek in her chair. Children would wave at her. Shopkeepers would greet her. She laughed more in those days than she had in years. The town had changed not through big speeches or loud actions, but through one simple act of kindness that grew like a seed. Thomas became known as more than just the town carpenter. To many, he was the man who reminded them what it meant to care, and Margaret, once left behind, became a symbol of hope. She spent her days on Thomas's porch, watching the sun set over the hills wrapped in a soft blanket. People often stopped by to talk to her. Some came for advice, some just to sit. She always had a kind word to offer. One evening, as Thomas fixed a fence nearby, Margaret looked at him and said, "You know, Thomas, when my family left me, I thought my story was over. But it wasn't. You gave me a new chapter." Thomas wiped his hands on his apron and looked at her with a soft smile. "I think sometimes life gives us second chances when we least expect it." The wind carried her gentle laughter across the yard. It was a peaceful sound. Years later, people in Dry Creek would still talk about the night Thomas Weller walked through the dark, with a lantern in his hand and kindness in his heart. They would tell their children how one quiet carpenter changed the way the whole town saw the world. It wasn't a story of riches or battles. It was a story of a man who didn't turn away, a story of a woman who found hope again, and a town that learned to be brave in the gentlest way possible.